Hi all, Dr. Clark here again. Okay. And to kind of finish up the talk or the discussion on Homo sapien evolution or human evolution, I just want to kind of go back to Darwin a little bit and talk about the criticism that Darwin had when it came to human evolution. Okay? So when Darwin published his book on natural selection by evolution by means of natural selection in 1859, he was ridiculed quite a bit for suggesting that humans had a common ancestor, and they shared a common ancestor with chimpanzees. And for a long time, people struggled with this, and really, the scientific community could produce as much evidence as they want on all other evolution. Almost every single other account of evolution was accepted by the general public. Okay, we could say, well, bacteria evolves. People say, okay, cool, sounds good to me. I believe it. Fish evolve, absolutely. Birds evolve, absolutely. Dogs evolve, all kinds of things, and there was no pushback. But still, even today, there are large groups of people that push back when we suggest that Homo sapiens had a common ancestor. No matter, even if we have massive amounts of evidence that suggests that, here's the line that we evolved from Australopithecus, and then there's a bunch of different Homo species. Okay, we share a common ancestor with chimpanzees. We can see that in our DNA and in our chromosomes, in our blood chemistry, but there's still pushback. Okay, and what I want to tell individuals who might have that pushback who are watching this, just have an open mind in the sense that science is not about, proving things wrong or right. Science is really about finding evidence. And if there's evidence against Homo sapien evolution, it will be found, okay, from a scientific point of view. If there's evidence and more evidence to be found for Homo sapien evolution, it will be found from a scientific point of view. And there's no reason to make, blanket statements that Homo sapiens didn't evolve. Okay? Because there's lots of evidence that we're still evolving. We're still changing. We're very different than what we were in the 1800s. And they were very different than what they were in the 1600s. And those are hundreds of years. We're talking about millions of years when we're talking about Homo sapien evolution. Okay, about 4 million years. Okay, so there are lots of programs out there. I'm going to talk about some of them that you can see for yourself. Okay, that your line, your Homo sapien line, your family line has changed. Where it came from, okay, and it's all in your DNA. Okay, so DNA is by far the most abundant piece of evidence for evolution. And as we progress, the concern now is not from scientists. It's not whether or not we evolved from a chimpanzee-like ancestor. We know that. Okay? We know that for a fact. It's very, very set in stone that occurred. But what we're worried about as scientists now is what's next. Okay? We created gene editing programs and abilities like CRISPR-Cas9. And what happens if we start editing the Homo sapien, the human genes? What if we start editing them? Okay? Are we causing evolution of our own species? What's the concern? Okay? That's to come. That's for people to ponder with. Do we want to do that? Okay? Do we want to be able to basically what would be considered is artificial select humans? Maybe, maybe not. Okay? A lot of people would say we should eradicate genetic disorders and diseases so people can live a happy, good life. Okay? But in doing so, are you changing Homo sapiens? Are you artificially selecting for humans? We'd be the only species to ever artificially select ourselves. Okay? And so that's the concern. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about ecology and things like that. And you might get it in future classes because it's becoming, a pretty hot topic in today's society with CRISPR-Cas9 being used on human embryos in China, and that can be a concern for some people. Okay? So let's talk about Homo sapien evolution, right? From the point of view that Heidelbergensis is a species, okay, in my opinion. So I am not, in the case of the Homo sapien evolution, I am not a lumper in this case. I am a splitter. I think there's enough evidence to split them out. So I'm going to present that to you. Okay? So Homo heidelbergensis is the oldest known modern human. Okay? And it dates back to about 600,000 years ago in Ethiopia. Okay? And we do know that based on fossil evidence, based on where we find the individuals, they coexisted with Homo erectus. Okay? They were probably more advanced and probably better suited for the current environment than Homo erectus. And like I said before, they most likely outcompeted them and caused Homo erectus to go extinct. Okay? Now, when we look at Heidelbergensis, one of the main reasons that we suggest that they are just not, it's not just a variety of Homo sapiens, is because they had some very unique features. They had a keel that runs across the midline of the skull. Okay, they had very thick eye sockets, and they had a very large brain. Okay? And so it probably means that they had a very powerful muscular skull, okay? Much more muscular than we see in Homo sapiens. Okay? Probably somewhere along the lines of similarities between Homo neanderthalensis and Homo heidelbergensis. Okay? We find fossils of Heidelbergensis in Africa, Europe, Western Asia. So they migrated out of Africa, okay, into Europe and into Western Asia. About 130,000 years ago, we start to pick up another variety of skull, okay, which we have identified as being Homo neanderthalensis. Okay, and we find it in Europe. Okay? Most likely, it evolved from Heidelbergensis, okay, in Europe. Compared to modern humans, Neanderthals were very different. Okay? Short, stocky, but based on the bone mass, okay, we would suggest that they were very muscular. Their skulls were much bigger than human skulls, okay, than Homo sapien skulls. Okay? They're massive skulls, not just in the brain capacity, but also in the jaw. Okay? Now, the oldest known fossil of Homo sapien is 130,000 years ago in Africa. So also probably evolved from Homo heidelbergensis. So Heidelbergensis probably gave rise to Neanderthals in Europe and Homo sapiens in Africa. Right? This is the most complete set of evidence for human evolution. Now, will this change? Probably. Okay? Will the years change? Maybe a little bit. Right? But will more fossils come, and we might actually date it further back, or closer to modern time? Who knows? Okay? But right now, this is where the evidence suggests, and we find more evidence of Homo sapiens in Africa every year. So outside of Africa and the Middle East, the oldest fossil that we find is about 40,000 years. That's Homo sapien. Okay? So it suggests that about 40,000 years ago, Homo sapien, humans, okay, migrated out of Africa. Okay? And that's what the evidence suggests from the fossil record, and that's also what the evidence from the genetic record suggests. Okay? And we'll look at this again. Okay, so what's implied by this is Homo sapiens first evolved in Africa, and then they migrated to the rest of the world. This is what's called the recently out of Africa model, okay, and it's the one that I would suggest has the most evidence for it, okay, and that's Homo sapiens evolved in Africa, migrated to Europe, Asia, and then across the land bridge about 15,000 years ago into North America and South America. There's another hypothesis that suggests a different ploy, that it's a multi-regional hypothesis, and that Homo sapiens evolved in different regions, Europe, Asia, and Africa, okay, independently from Homo erectus, from Homo heidelbergensis, from Homo neanderthalensis. But the problem with the multi-region hypothesis, okay, is the fossil evidence is not there, and the genetic evidence is completely missing. And so that suggests that the multi-region hypothesis is probably not very well supported. Although there are still some scientists that say that, based on different human races, this is probably what happened. Okay? Genetically speaking, though, we don't think that's the case. Okay? And this really comes from quite a few different point of views. So first, when we take human mitochondrial DNA, so if you remember way back, first couple lectures, I told you that you get your mitochondrial from your mother. Okay? So your dad has no effect on your mitochondrial. You get your mitochondrial DNA from the mother line. So what we can do is we can just track the mitochondrial DNA. And we can track it for a bunch of different people, a bunch of different races, which are really just different varieties of people. Okay? There's no clear-cut difference in DNA. But we can look at different regions of the world, and we can pull individuals' mitochondrial DNA, and we can look to see how long they've been diverged from each other. And the longer you've been diverged, say in North America, South America, the more changes you should have in your mitochondrial DNA. The closer you are related to the original population, the less changes in your mitochondrial DNA you should find. We also use nuclear DNA, and we can use like Y chromosomes, and we can track the male line. Okay? But in both cases, when we look at the Homo sapiens, we can use these techniques, and we've already talked about mutations over time in genes and in regions that may even not code for anything, but you still have regions of your DNA that are going to mutate. Okay? The greater the amount of mutations, the greater the difference, the greater the time span that they've been separated. When we look at this, we can look at it across every ethnic background. It's been done for hundreds of thousands of people, okay, all over the world. Okay, it could be that we're even well over 1 million people that have done this, if not more than that, okay, of all kinds of ethnic backgrounds. Okay? And every single person dates back to common ancestry about 170,000 years ago in Africa. So 52,000 years ago, Africans separated from non-Africans. That's what the genetic data suggests. Okay? Both mitochondrial DNA and nuclear DNA suggest that if you're not 100% African, or your ancestry is not directly from African ancestry, that the rest of the world diverged from Africans 52,000 years ago. That's when Homo sapiens left Africa. Okay? At least a portion of Homo sapiens left Africa. The migration out of Africa went in two directions based on the genes. Okay? One went Middle East and into Europe, and the other one went kind of India into Asia, and that's the branch that went across into North America. So the path at which was taken out of Africa does kind of mimic the path that we see that Homo erectus took out of Africa a million years or so before. So here's this path. Okay, so out of Africa, about 50,000 years ago, either one group of Homo sapiens went Europe, one group of Homo sapiens went Asia, okay? And this could have happened many times. Okay? So we think that they were following herds of animals or following, some type of habitat or some type of ecological needs. They were following them out of Africa. Some went to Europe, some went into India, okay? Some crossed over into Indonesia, into Australia, okay? And then some of the Asian populations eventually went across the Bering Strait into North America. So when we look at other regions, a lot of this evidence suggests this to be true, except for there are small regions in the world that might have their own species, okay? Or possibly had a different species at a given time. So when Erectus left Africa, it's quite possible that it could have went into Indonesia, and that we had a Homo floresiens, okay, that occurred in that region, and then eventually mated with Homo sapiens, okay, and you lose that species and you get the hybridization, okay, and Homo sapiens is the current species. Okay? And so it depends on what piece of evidence you look at, which genetic markers, etc. But there is some evidence of there being some very unique Indonesian genetics that didn't come from the original Homo sapien line. The other thing that suggests, based on some genetic studies, is that, again, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens existed together. They coexisted, in Asia and potentially in Europe 40,000 years ago or so. So right as Homo sapiens were leaving Africa and migrating either into Asia or into Europe, Neanderthals were still alive. Neanderthals were still in the region, and Homo sapiens associated with them. In fact, there is some evidence that suggests that Homo sapiens killed Neanderthals. There are some sites where it looks like Homo sapiens, because they had a different way of making tools. They were in a cave, and at the bottom of the cliff or whatever, we find Neanderthals, bones of Neanderthals, evidence of Neanderthals, with even spear tips and things like that embedded into their bones, as if Homo sapiens definitely killed Neanderthals. Now, genetic evidence also suggests that maybe they mated with Neanderthals. So it gets confusing because the fossil evidence is not all there. But as time goes, just like with all other species that we've worked out, um, we will eventually get to a pretty streamlined evidence suggesting what human evolution was. So Neanderthals most likely were a species of Homo, um, and they were common in Europe and Asia about 70,000 years ago. So, that's where they evolved. They evolved from Heidelbergensis. Okay? And again, they, coexisted with Homo sapiens. Okay? Now, like I said before, some people say they did not interbreed. Okay? I don't personally feel they interbred. Okay? This is my opinion, that they did not interbreed. Okay? But if you look at the genes and you look at the genetics, every single person on the planet has Homo neanderthalensis genes. Now that doesn't mean that we interbred, it means that we could have just carried those genes over from Heidelbergensis. It could be that we carried those genes over Homo erectus, okay, which we probably did because we share 1.4, or we share 98.6 or 98.4% of our DNA with chimpanzees. So we carried massive amounts of genes over from chimpanzees. So it's quite possible that we're just carrying these genes over and we actually didn't interbreed. And that's my belief, because it looks like Homo sapiens fought Homo neanderthalensis. Okay, Cro-Magnons, okay, these are Homo sapiens, okay, and we find evidence of them somewhere around 100,000 years ago in Europe. Okay, so after they left Africa, um, you know, they might. This is where a lot of the evidence gets kind of shady. This is why some lumpers say, well, there's no actual difference between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, because Cro-Magnons were in Europe before we say modern humans, Homo sapiens, left Africa. Um, it, the evidence is shady, at best. But nonetheless, we do know that Homo sapiens definitely competed with Neanderthals. Right? And because Homo sapiens, they were smaller, but they seem to be smarter. And they seem to be more sociable than Neanderthals. And so they outcompeted Neanderthals and probably eradicated Neanderthals and caused them to go extinct. Whether that happened 34,000 years ago, which is what suggested that Homo sapiens left about 50,000 years ago out of Africa and then made it to Europe, or whether that happened prior to that, even 100,000 years ago, we don't really know. Right? So modern Homo sapiens, we know based on fairly good information that there's a land bridge between North America and Europe, or what we now call Siberia or Russia, about 13,000 years ago. Now this depends on what evidence you look at. Okay? Now the genomic evidence, the DNA evidence is clear cut. This is exactly what occurred. Asians, or Asian descendants moved across the land bridge, came into North America and South America. That is 100% clear. The time period is in question, though, because there's fossil evidence in places like Colorado that suggests that it wasn't 13,000 years ago, but more like 15,000 years ago. So that it actually suggests that humans have been in North America for, a few thousand more years than what originally was suggested. Okay? But regardless, the path is pretty similar. Okay? And as we progress in evolutionary span, whether it is true that we have Neanderthalensis and Heidelbergensis, regardless, we know that there was at least 3 species of Homo, And they had very different abilities to socialize, make tools. They had different body forms. And the main one was the size of the brain. And as we progress, the ability to conceptually think increased. Okay? And even today, our brains are still evolving. Okay? There is really good evidence from neurology and things like that that suggests that today, individuals who are born in this generation will have more synapses, more connections than their grandparents, and even in some evidence than their parents. And which means that their ability to conceptually think, okay, increases. It doesn't mean they utilize it, okay, but they have the ability, a greater capacity to think than previous generations. Right? And there's pretty good evidence for that. Lots of papers out there. If you want some, send me an email and I'll get you some papers on it. All right, so some of you have probably heard of these different genetic tracking companies out there. I believe National Geographic was the very first, and I jumped on the chance to do this when it really first came out. I think it came out in 2007 or somewhere around there. I had my DNA ran by National Geographic in like 2008. It was fairly expensive at the time. I think it was like $200 or something like that when it first came out, and it was, it was not nearly what it is today. Okay? But I wanted to be able to do it so I could track my ancestry because of what people have told me about, my, the male line in particular in my family, and I wanted to see if, it's true. Okay? And that's why people a lot of times are doing this, is to check, well, you were told this by your grandparents or your great-grandparents, and on and on and on, and you got all this history passed down. Is it true? Okay, so we're going to watch a little video about National Geographic genealogy kind of experiment. And I'm not saying that you should do National Geographic or 23andMe or DNAancestral.com or any of these companies. I'm not suggesting that you do them. I'm not promoting any of these organizations. But I will tell you, if you have questions about, how much of you is Native American? What do you have any unique genetic markers, okay, that the majority of the world don't have? Okay? If you just want to know, are you French? Are you Italian? Now we have the capability of doing that. When I first originally took it, it wasn't the case. Okay? We didn't have that capability, and I'll talk about my test in just a second and show you the results after the video.
This is who we are.
Many faces.
Many differences.
Yet all of us are connected.
Our connection runs deeper than we could have ever imagined.
The story is told through our DNA. It tells us where our ancestors began and traces their journeys over thousands of years to arrive at where you stand today.
It's your story.
Our story.
The human story.
National Geographic's Genographic project has been breaking new ground to get the real story of our shared ancestry. We believe that by understanding who we are and where we came from, we'll have a better sense of where we might be going. And now, new scientific advances allow us to go deeper than ever. Introducing Geno 2.0, cutting-edge technology that examines nearly 150,000 DNA identifiers called markers to trace your history from the very beginning of your ancestral lineage up to your recent past. Join more than 500,000 people who've already taken part in this breakthrough scientific project. By participating, you'll learn more about yourself than you ever thought possible and contribute to a broader, more detailed picture of our shared history.
You'll also be helping us conserve and revitalize indigenous cultures around the world through the Genographic Legacy Fund.
This is your story.
Our story.
A human story.
National Geographic's Genographic Project.
Okay, so there you can see the Genographic Project by National Geographic. That's just one. You can watch tons of different videos from these different companies and organizations that would like to collect your DNA. And it's not that they're going to do anything with your DNA. They're not going to clone you. You're not going to, later on fly to a different country and see an identical copy of you. But the more individuals that they collect DNA from, the better the picture gets. Okay? The more evidence we get for what are the differences between different regions of the world. Okay? How are they similar? What are the potential disease differences? If a disease breaks out, what population might survive? Okay? And we found a lot of information about humans from these different genealogical or gene projects. Okay? So I was interested in this kind of the original project. So this is not 2.0. It's not even 1.0. It's like 0.5, National Geographic, very beginning, okay, of National Geographic Genealogical Project, and I was involved in kind of the very beginning, and there was very little DNA, or very little known at the time, and you can just think about this. It was only 9 years ago or so, maybe 10 years ago, that I did this project, okay, on my own DNA. And, in 10 years, it's drastically changed to the point where I'll eventually do it again, okay? But the results really haven't changed all that much for me, okay? But I'll show you the results in a second. So when I originally did it, you had two options, and now you can now they just run all of it, okay, for you. But you had two options. You could choose your maternal line, where they're going to analyze your mitochondrial DNA, okay? Or you could choose your paternal line, your dad's line, or the father line, if you're a male, okay? And this is the one that I chose, where they're looking at the Y chromosome, and only the Y chromosome. And they're looking at 12 different markers on the Y chromosome. Now think about this. You just heard that video. They look at 1,500 markers now. When I did it, they looked at 12. Okay? So the amount of material, the amount of evidence, the amount of certainty that they're getting today is much greater than what they were getting 10 years ago. But nonetheless, okay, that evidence is still working with just simple genetics that you already know because you've taken this course, in that mitochondria comes from the mother. Okay? So it doesn't matter male or female, the mitochondria is coming from the mother line. So here's a female mitochondria, this grandfather's got it, okay? But if you're a son here, whatever your mother's got is what you got. So you don't get the father line of mitochondria, you get the mother line of mitochondria. Okay? The Y chromosome is the exact opposite. Female line doesn't have it, okay? And the Y chromosome is just going to come straight down from the father's line. Okay? This is important, at least at the beginning. Now they're not looking at just Y in the mitochondria, they're looking at all the chromosomes, all your chromosomes. So, companies like 23andMe, they're looking at all 23 chromosomes. Okay? National Geographic, they don't have to call themselves, 23andMe, but they're looking at all your chromosomes. And so they're looking at markers across all chromosomes. And so the amount of information is much greater. Okay? But I was interested, okay, so this is my haplogroup, okay, G. I'm M201, okay? So track me back to, the Rift Valley or Africa. That Homo sapien line left Africa, and my Y chromosome, okay, my ancestors, instead of going to Europe, they went into India. Okay. Now I know this because this is a picture of my grandfather. He was a half-blood Ute, and his father was a full-blood Ute, okay, which makes me an 8th Ute. But I knew that his father was a full-blood Ute because he told me so, and I know that he was half because I knew my great-grandmother. But I wanted to make sure, based on that lineage, that I inherited his Y chromosome through my dad. Okay? And so my dad gave me my Y chromosome, okay? And all of us will have this exact same pattern. Now, we do know that the Utes and all Native Americans went across the land bridge. But the M201, when I did the test, was so rare that only probably 1% of the world's population, 7 billion people, 1% had that marker. Now, does that mean that I'm unique genetically? Probably not. It just means that they only had 12 markers that they were looking at, okay? And I had one, that it was not really common. Okay? If I did it today, would the pattern continue? Most likely it would show that there's these other markers that would carry me over the Bering Strait, into North America, where my great-grandfather was born as 100% Ute. Okay? And so the reason why I bring up kind of my story is to show you that even though 10 years ago, with 12 markers, it was showing my family line coming out of Africa, you now can use 1,500 markers, and we still come out of Africa. Everyone comes out of Africa. Doesn't matter if you're European, doesn't matter if you're Native American, Asian. If you're African, you stay in Africa. Most people do. Okay? But even if you're Australian, you came out of Africa. Okay? So the evidence from the genes, from the genetics, okay, track here. The evidence from the fossils, okay, track to the same place. So here you can see Homo fossils, okay, in the same Rift Valley as Australopithecus fossils, and as Eretopithecus, which gave rise to Australopithecus, okay, and all of these fossils, in the same general region in Ethiopia. Okay, massive amounts of evidence for human evolution, and as we start working more with genes and chromosomes and really diving into the ability to analyze different populations, the picture just becomes more clear and more clear. Okay, all right. So with that, okay, we'll start talking about ecology, and that kind of ends the human evolution. But we'll still come back and talk about how ecology, right, which is how organisms interact within their environment, how that dictates evolution also. Okay, next time.